Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Semino, and I coordinate adult programs here, and I'm very happy to see you all here today on this gorgeous spring afternoon, almost summer. Couple housekeeping items. If you could take out your phones and silence them, that would be very much appreciated. And in case of an emergency, we have exits on your right and left. I feel like a flight attendant. Anyway, today we have America's gratitude guru and New York Times bestselling author Janice Kaplan. She's here to present her new book, What Your Body Knows About Happiness. Some of you may have heard of the book The Body Keeps Score, where the author discusses how trauma affects the body and the mind. Well, Janice has a new twist on how the mind-body connection works and how it connects to happiness. And I think that's a refreshing way to look at it. So Janice's previous best-selling book, which you might have heard of, was called The Gratitude Diaries. And that is a smart and witty journey to discover the value of appreciating what you have. She's been featured in Time, The Wall Street Journal, The Today Show, the CBS Morning Show, among, I'm sure, many others. Janice also hosted a daily podcast called The Gratitude Diaries for iHeartMedia and boosted readership to 74 million people as editor-in-chief of Parade magazine. So Janice graduated magna cum laude from Yale University and won Yale's Murray Fellowship Award for writing. So we are among greatness here. And she splits her time between New York City and Kent, Connecticut. Elm Street Books is here selling her book, and you can get it personalized after the lecture. Janice is going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be a question and answer time. So please help me welcome Janice Kaplan.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here on this very beautiful day. Heather was kind enough to give me a tour of this gorgeous library, and I thought I could be happy here. It's very, very nice. And, you know, as I was coming in from Manhattan this morning, I was thinking about happiness, as I tend to do. And it occurred to me that nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, I'd like to be unhappy today. We all want to be happy, right? And one of the problems is that we tend to think of events as determining whether or not it's going to be a good day. And when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries, I started to realize that we have so much more control over our happiness and our attitudes than we sometimes realize. And so what I hope to do in the next few minutes that we all have here together is to give you and the dog some techniques and some thoughts on what we can all do in our daily lives so that we do feel better and we have that happiness and joy that we can extend to ourselves, to our friends, and to our families. So let me see if I can figure this out. There we go. So let me start off by telling you a story about really what got me writing this particular book. My husband and I were on a vacation, and I know it's hard to get sympathy for a vacation in the Caribbean story, but stick with me here. So it was one of those days where everything seems to go wrong, where the luggage was lost, the flight was delayed, and we got to the little airport on our way, and I was just feeling extremely frustrated and getting very tense. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm the gratitude lady. I'm not allowed to behave this way. So I started doing all of the little tricks that I had learned when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries. You know, you can change your perspective. So I thought, okay, my luggage is lost, but I'm grateful that I have a swimsuit in my carry-on. And I was, doing all these little things, and it worked pretty well, and it got me out of the airport. But then we were on a boat going to our final destination, and the sun was shining, the water was sparkling, and all of a sudden I just felt happy. I didn't have to do any little tricks. I didn't have to use my mind at all. I just felt happy. And I thought, what just happened here? And that's when it occurred to me that our bodies are sometimes sending information to our minds. And that actual moment of standing in the boat and just feeling myself relaxed in the beautiful day is really what got me interested in body-mind connections. And I'm sure you've all had that experience, right? You've been outside, you've been on a beach, you've taken a walk, and all of a sudden the stresses of the day just sort of disappear. So, one of the first things I found as I started doing the research is that we think of our brain as being the big computer, right, that controls everything. Now, I'm sure you all have wonderful brains, but your brain is basically a 3-pound blob sitting inside of a very dark skull. And it can't come up with anything on its own. It is completely dependent on the information that it's getting from your body, from your environment, from your senses, the things you touch, smell, and see. And so realizing that things are going both ways is a really important start. And we know messages go from our brain to our body, but our brain is constantly scanning our body to figure out what's going on. Somebody described the brain to me as a prediction machine, that it's just taking in all of the experiences that you have and trying to predict what's going to happen next. One of the first pieces of research that got me really interested was done by a professor named John Barge at Yale University. And he's a fascinating professor, and he did this experiment where he invited volunteers, which always means college students, to his lab. And when they got to his lab, somebody met them downstairs and invited them into the elevator. And she was holding books, and she was fumbling with her papers, and she was holding a cup of coffee. And she would ask the student, "Would you just hold this for me for a minute?" While she, got herself organized, and then had the student give it back. And then they got to the lab and did what they thought was the experiment, which was where they were asked to evaluate certain people that they met. But the real experiment was that she had given some of the people iced coffee to hold, and she had given some of the people hot coffee to hold. And believe it or not, the people who were holding the hot coffee described the people that they met later as being warmer and kinder than the people who were holding the iced coffee. Now, this sounds a little bit crazy. I'm not going to say otherwise. But this kind of research has been repeated over and over again. There was a study at the University of Michigan, which was done by a business school professor. And he was looking at negotiations and negotiating tactics. And he was looking at it, he set up this experiment in terms of having people pretend that they were negotiating for a car. And it turned out that the people who were sitting in hard chairs, like you are, negotiated harder than the people who were sitting in soft chairs. Now, it may be that when you're sitting in a hard chair, you're slightly uncomfortable there, and your body is getting some message of irritation, and so you're more likely to negotiate harder. Or it may just be that our brains also think a little bit in metaphors. Soft chair, soft heart. So those are fun experiments, but there's actually some very practical use for this. So, for example, if I could ask you all to sit up a little bit straighter right now, thank you. You're going to like me a lot better. You will see once you're sitting up straighter. There's research that shows that when you sit and stand straight, you have more access to positive emotions. And you could read about it in the book. There's some fascinating research on exactly how that happens. But if you think about it almost intrinsically, when you're depressed, you slouch, right? When you're depressed, your body goes into a slouch. And so your brain that's constantly scanning this body, when it finds you in a slouch, it starts to feel kind of negative. And when you're standing up straight, your body goes, okay, your brain goes, okay, everything is all right here. And, I mentioned finding these little techniques to add to your happiness. And that's one of the things that I've added to my arsenal. I've discovered that I talked before about how when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries, it was about changing your perspective and looking at things differently. And I find sometimes when I'm in Manhattan, I'm walking down the street, and I look in one of the store windows, and I see, who is that woman who's all slouched over and looking angry? And I go, oh, that must be me. And I will stop at the corner and literally stand up straight and look up, and all of a sudden you do feel better. It's just the smallest little thing, but it is just like one of those little tricks that you can use, and then you can take the moment to think about feeling more positive. Women get told to smile too often, I understand that, but it turns out not to be a bad thing. Now, many of you may be familiar with the smile experiment that was done some years ago by a famous professor in Germany. And he gave people a pencil to hold between their lips. And some of the people, the pencil was put in such a way that it forced their face into a smile, and some so that it forced their face into a frown. And the people whose face was forced into a smile ended up finding comic strips funnier than the people who found it whose faces were in a frown. And they were generally happier. Now, I like to think that my brain is smart enough to tell the difference between my having a pencil in my mouth and my having a genuine smile, but it turns out it's not. There's something that's called the facial feedback hypothesis, which means that your brain is, again, checking the facial muscles and going, oh, it's in a smile, I think things are good, I'm happy. Or you're frowning, and that sends a negative message. Now, one of the interesting offshoots of this is that there's been some research on Botox, finding that if you have Botox and you can't frown, maybe you can't get as unhappy. And there is some research looking at Botox and depression. Now, I don't use Botox, but if you need an excuse to use it that has nothing to do with vanity, I have just given you one. One of the best things you can do to increase your happiness is simply to go outside. And you're in this beautiful location where I'm sure you all do that very often. There was some research that I looked at was called the Mappiness Project out of the UK. I think it's probably the worst titled research I've come up with, but it's a combination between map and happiness. And what they did is that they gave people GPS watches, and then they would buzz them several times during the day and ask them to evaluate, on a scale of 1 to 10, how they were feeling. And then they tried to coordinate how these people were feeling with where they were. It was a huge study, and they ended up with 4 million pieces of data. I think it may still be ongoing. It may have doubled by now. I don't know. But when I looked at it, they had 4 million pieces of data. And the number one connection they could find for happiness was being outdoors, and being outdoors anywhere. They said the researchers said that people dramatically underestimate how much happier they will be outside. And they said that the delta, the difference between being indoors and outside someplace beautiful was as much as being outside with friends versus doing the laundry, or doing something you love versus something you don't. So it's a very simple thing to go outdoors, and we're not exactly sure why it works, but research endlessly has shown that. Similarly, being near water seems to have amazing effects, and it doesn't have to be the ocean. It's a pond, a stream, a lake. There's a researcher out of Vienna named Matthew White who found that being near water 2 hours a week dramatically improves people's happiness. And again, it doesn't have to be 2 hours all at once, a half an hour a day, or a little walk around the water. And again, we're not completely sure why that is, but there's something about water that's kind of magical. Water's always changing. And researchers refer to it as soft fascination, which means it's interesting enough to keep you interested, and it's different enough that you're always looking at it, but it's not so overwhelming that your mind can't wander or that you can't talk to somebody. So if you're looking to have a conversation, the perfect place is in front of water. And think about it, if you're not going to sit here and just stare out at something like that, but if this were water, you would, because it interests you and it's ever changing. So again, one more little trick that you can use. I'm a writer, and I spend most of my time hunched over a laptop, though I try to sit up when I remember. And it turns out that's, and sometimes I'll sit there and I'll say, okay, you're not getting up until you finish this chapter. And if I'm stuck, it's too bad. And of course, that turns out to be, the worst thing that you can do, because our creativity is unleashed by movement. And there have been many, many studies that show the connection between creativity and movement. And it's the same with our children. When we tell kids as they get a little bigger, sit down and focus, sit down and concentrate, we diagnose kids as being ADHD, and many of the times those kids are right. They don't want to sit down and focus. They focus much better when they move around. I like to be, when I'm giving a talk, I like to be able to move around. I don't want to be caught sitting down or standing somewhere. I can think much better if I'm moving. There was a study out of Stanford university that looked at the connection between creativity and movement. And the reason I have the key there is because when psychologists are doing studies on creativity, they have these certain things that they do. And one of the common ones is they ask you how many uses you can come up with for a key. And it has to be both original and creative. So if you say, I'm going to use the key to open my door, you get 0 points, not original. If you say, I'm going to use it to tie my shoes, again, 0 points, not feasible. But if you say, I'm going to use it to clean the treads on my sneakers, absolutely, that's creative use of the key. I read somebody got points for saying I would use it to carve the name of my murderer into the sand as I lay dying. So this researcher whose study was called Give Your Ideas Some Legs put people on either a treadmill or at a desk and asked them to come up with the uses for a key. And it turned out that the people who were on the treadmill came up with 50% more uses than the people who were sitting at the desk. And of course, it's the exact opposite of what we think. We think that we'll focus much better if we're focused, right? But it turns out walking is probably the best way to release ideas. And I have a section in the book where I talk about the many writers through history and the poets who did so much by being out and walking and letting ideas flow that way. Similarly, if you doodle, it turns out to be a good thing. Now, I'm a doodler. I'm a terrible drawer. But whenever I'm on a phone call, I make these like geometric doodles. And I do this when I'm at conferences and when I'm sitting and listening to something. And I always thought it was a way to keep myself from being bored. But it turns out to be the opposite. It turns out that it's a way to help yourself concentrate more. Again, a study, I'm sorry, I read too many studies, but there was another study out of the UK where people were asked to listen to phone messages. And half the people were told to doodle geometric shapes, as it turned out, while they were listening to the messages, and the other half were told to focus and concentrate on the messages. Now, once again, just like with getting up and moving around, you would think that the people who were focusing on the messages would remember more of them, but it turned out that the people who were doodling remembered 30% more of the messages than the others. And so, once again, that sense of our bodies being in motion, doing something, inspiring our brains is really, really important. I'm going to switch to a slightly different subject, which is food. Which was a really fun section of the book to research. Now, it does say that why wine tastes better in Paris, and I'll tell you how I came onto that. I was in Paris on another vacation with my husband, and I drink hardly at all, but it was Paris. And we were in this little cafe, and we ordered a bottle of wine, and we started drinking it, and I said to my husband, this is the best wine I have ever had. This is just amazing. This wine is so wonderful. And my husband's a very nice man. He took a picture of the bottle. He went home. He went to our local wine store. He asked the guy, can you get this bottle? He said, sure, I'll find it. He brought it in. And my husband went to pick it up, and the guy at the wine store handed it to him, and he said, here it is. I got it for you. But I got to tell you, it's not going to drink like it did in Paris. And of course, he was right, because in Paris, I wasn't just drinking the wine, right? I was drinking in the cafe we were in. I was drinking and being in Paris. I was drinking and being relaxed and being with my husband in this beautiful spot. We think that we eat with our mouths and nose, we know we smell things, but with our mouths and smell. But it turns out that we eat and experience food with all of our senses. And there's a wonderful professor at Oxford University named Charles Spence who's done some really fascinating research with that. For example, he had a chef come in, and he gave the chef ingredients of a salad. And he asked the chef to arrange it, and this is not a picture of that, but to arrange it to look like a particular Kandinsky painting that he loved. And then to do the same salad in a bowl. Well, people thought that the salad that was arranged as a Kandinsky painting was so much tastier than the salad that was just in the bowl. And he discovered that when people are given a dessert on a white plate, they think it tastes much sweeter than when it's on a black plate. And if you're having a little cocktail party, don't bother to go out and buy expensive cheese. Just get an angular plate. People apparently think cheese tastes better if they're eating it from an angular plate. Something else I found when I was doing the research into food, and there's lots of this in the book, is that it turns out that the first taste of any food is the one that tastes the best. And the reason for that is reasonable, is clear. Our brains, and again, those great brains that you all have, our brains are kind of lazy, and our brains like it when everything is in the status quo. They don't have to pay attention. When everything is flat and as it's always been, they don't pay attention. And it's only when something is new that your brain perks up, right? And if you think of it in terms of evolution, that makes sense. If everything is normal, you don't have to pay attention. As soon as something is different, you better pay attention because it might be a problem, or it might be good. So the person who had done the study on food described it to me as thinking of it in terms of eating a bowl of chocolate mousse. So you're eating a bowl of chocolate mousse, and the first taste, really great, it's a 10. Second taste, probably still good, 10. Third taste, getting a little used to it, maybe you're at a 9. Next, 8. By the time you're at the bottom of the bowl, maybe you're at a 3. What he found is that your enjoyment of that chocolate mousse is not the sum of all of those numbers, but it's the average of them. So if you stop eating while you're still at a higher number, if you stop eating after the few bites while you're still excited about it, you're actually going to appreciate it better. And you're actually going to think that it was tastier. Now, I think about this in terms of some of those really expensive restaurants, you know, where there's always the chef's tasting menu and there are 10 courses. I think those chefs are getting away with murder, because I think what happens is they bring you out like a little teeny taste of something, and it's on a beautiful plate, and you taste it and you go, that's amazing. And then they whisk it away before you get to go like, I didn't really like the pistachio in that so much. But it turns out to be true that if you just, and I've tried this with dessert. I like dessert. But I have tried sometimes stopping after, halfway through and going, yeah, that's right. That was the pleasure that I needed. I didn't need to finish it. Now, the one caveat to this I will say is that one of my closest friends is a writer in Los Angeles. When the book first came out, he called me. He said, said kind things about the book, how much he liked it. And he said, but there's one thing that you got completely wrong. And it was about the food. And he said, I had a platter of brownies last night. I ate the entire thing, and the last one tasted just as good as the first one. And he promised to continue research the next day with macaroons. So I guess there is something personal about it, but the idea of that first taste is also just to remind you that trying something new always does perk up your brain. And, in addition to food, there are other things that you can do. Taste something different, go someplace different. When you're driving home today, go in a different way and get yourself lost for 5 minutes and look at a different place. I will sometimes do that even in New York. I'll just go to a different part of the city. You perk up. You see things in a different way than when you're looking at the same things over and over again. One other topic I can raise for you is about stress in terms of your body. We think of stress as being something bad, right? And we all want to avoid stress and cut down stress. Some of the researchers I talked to said we just need to think about stress in a different way. Stress is actually meant to be something that gets you ready for something important. And stress is a way of preparing for a big event. So think about when you're stressed about something. You're going in to ask your boss for a raise, or you're going to give a talk at your child's wedding, and you feel yourself really stressed. And so what do? Your heart is pounding, your hands are sweaty, but what do you say to yourself? You're like, no, I'm good, I'm calm, not a problem. And your brain, the same brain we've been talking about this whole time that's constantly scanning, your brain goes, you are so not calm. I'm sorry, not buying that. Your chest is pounding and your hands are sweaty. So you can't fool your body, but you can trick your brain. What you can do is look for what gives the same symptoms as that stress. Well, excitement, right? When you're excited about something, your heart is also pounding and your hands are also sweating. So if you turn it around and think about it as, no, I'm not nervous about asking my boss for a raise. I'm excited to let him know all the good things I've done here and how much I can do for this company moving forward. Or you're giving a talk at your child's wedding and you think, I'm not nervous that I'm going to blow it and embarrass myself. I'm excited to get to tell my child how much I love them in front of all these people. And that's what I want to do. There was a wonderful study where students were taught this technique, this way of thinking about things differently. And it was kids who were taking, who had graduated college and were taking the business exams. I forget what those are called. Whatever they are, you all know. They were given practice business exams. And the students who had learned this technique, and I think they had several classes of cognitive behavioral therapy to learn how to change the sense of stress to a sense of excitement. The people who did that did dramatically better on the business boards. And they did dramatically better again 3 months later when they took the actual boards. So it's, again, one of those little techniques that you can use to help yourself. I just want to tell one final story about body-brain connections and how they sometimes work in a way we don't expect. While I was writing the book, I bought a new iPhone. And I brought the iPhone home, and I just didn't like it. It just wasn't working as good as my old as well as my old iPhone, and I wasn't happy with it, and just everything about it was annoying me. And the apps nothing seemed to be good. I didn't like the camera. I went back to the Apple store, and I went to the young man who was there, and I told him the problem. He looked at it, and he said, I think it's the case that you chose. I said, the case? He said, yeah, I'm finding that people who have that case that you got, and I got the cheapest case. I got that sort of, plastic rectangular one with the edges. He said, I'm finding that people who bought that case don't like the iPhone. Would you mind, and I'll just give it to you, would you mind if I gave you a silicone case instead? So I said, sure, I think you're crazy, but he said, if I'm crazy, come back and we'll work on the phone. So we put the silicone case on and I went home, and I wasn't thinking about it, but I was going like, wow, I really, this camera actually is pretty good, isn't it? And these apps, I'm kind of liking these apps. The phone suddenly was much better. And I realized what it was that case, he was right. It was really uncomfortable in my hand. It was really clumsy and uncomfortable in my hand. And so my brain was constantly getting the message of being unhappy and of disliking things. And our brains don't discriminate that well, so I just disliked the whole phone. And once the phone felt comfortable and pleasant in my hand, I liked the phone, and I didn't have to go back and get a new one. But so it's just a way of saying that be aware of the environment around you. Be aware of whether you're sitting in a hard chair or a soft chair. Be aware of how you may feel differently about things when you're holding an iced coffee or a hot coffee. And be aware about that first taste of that chocolate mousse and how different it might be from the last one. So I think partly or probably the main thing that I learned from writing both the Gratitude Diaries and What Your Body Knows About Happiness is that we do have more control over our happiness than we think. And when the whole world feels like it's out of control, being able to know that you can change how you feel about something, that no matter how bad an event is, you can stop and say, okay, I'm going to find the good side to it. I'm going to look for something positive, and that you can use your body and your environment and the places you go and how you move to make yourself feel better really can help you find more happiness every day. So thank you, and I am happy to take some questions. Someone must have a question. Go ahead. On physical ailments. It's an interesting question, and I found when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries that I knew I was going from good to better in my life. I'm not pretending that I had anything difficult to deal with, but I did a lot of touring and talking with that book, and people would come up to me and tell me things like horrible stories of illness and suicide and terrible things that they and their family members had, and they would tell me how they used gratitude to get through it. And I remember one young woman it was tragic. She had stage 4 ovarian cancer, and she said, "But you know, I get to go to my treatments with my sister, and we've become so close. And so we're so grateful that we get to be together, and we go out and we laugh afterwards, and we have ice cream." And I was just so moved by that and similar stories, so that I think again you can often change how you think about an ailment. I have an entire chapter, actually two chapters in the book about pain. Because, and I didn't get into it in this discussion, but I hope you'll read about it, because there's a lot of research now on pain, chronic pain being different from acute pain. So if you cut your finger or you break your leg, that's an acute pain, and it's going to be gone in a few days. If you have a backache, a neck, shoulder pain, you know, chronic pain that goes on for, and I think chronic pain is considered more than 3 months, the research has found that it's a completely different pain circuit, and that it's no longer something that you can solve locally because the pain is going through your brain. The circuit is going through your brain. You can think of it as like, you know, those electric sets you make with your kids where they have to get the circuits right, and the little red light is going to go on if they get it right, and you can interrupt the circuit anywhere. Well, think of a pain circuit as being that way. And so what some of the pain doctors are starting to do now is to try to interrupt the pain in the brain rather than at the localized spot. So I think there's all sorts of interesting work going on now between your physical being and your attitude. But certainly, let me just say one other thing, which is that adding to the idea of the connections between body and mind, you know, if something hurts, if I get a splinter, you know, I can be miserable for a day, right? It's just like all you can think about. So that our bodies are constantly sending that information, and I think that's why the information on chronic pain and how to interrupt it is so important. Yes. You know, that's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. But certainly exercise affects you in so many ways, and I'm sure that, yes, uh, that the blood flow is one of them. One of the interesting things, though, is that, you know, how if you're a runner, and people talk about the runner's high that you get, and for years we talked about it as being endorphins, the endorphins that are released and that are found in the blood. And that was just, you know, the what everybody talked about. But it turns out endorphins don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So endorphins never get to your brain. But there is another chemical that is very much like, I'm going to get this wrong. Does anybody use cannabis? What's the THC? Is it THC? Is that what it is? There's a chemical that gets released in your body when you run, which is identical to THC. And so that seems to be what produces the quite literal runner's high. But, you know, when I mentioned water and exercise is similar to what happens with water, is that it does change your physiology. So your blood pressure goes down, and cortisol levels go down, and, you know, a beating heart gets well, not while you're exercising, but a beating heart, you know, it changes. So all of those physiological changes are having a big effect. Yes. It was when you were at Carnegie Hall that it was. Well, that's a great example, though, of what we were just talking about with stress and excitement. Your stress level wasn't up, your stress level was fine, right? You were excited, you were thrilled, you were listening to something wonderful. So, part of the problem with measuring is what you're measuring maybe isn't quite what it should be. Yeah. I talk in the book also on the measuring topic about Fitbits, um, and how, if you want to know how many steps you're doing, absolutely, but it's meaningless. And if anything, if you're a professional athlete or you're trying to run a marathon or do something and it's important to know what your training level is, that's great. But if you're looking to just enjoy your activity, then just go out and enjoy it. And sometimes the measuring of things takes the pleasure away from it. And you're doing it in order, you're going out for a walk in a beautiful spot, and you're so focused on how many steps am I getting in that you're not getting the pleasure of walking in a beautiful spot. So there's a lot of evidence that kind of measurement is not particularly helpful. I say that knowing full well that my husband and both of my sons are constantly on their watches and posting on Strava exactly how far they have gotten and sending each other, oh, you improved by 0.2%. I just think we sometimes we sometimes take the joy out of things when it's really what we're looking for is more joy, not less. And good for Ann Patchett. She's a great writer and makes sense that she wrote on the treadmill. Yes. It what? It's such a great question because it's so frustrating, right? And I actually have a friend who I wrote about in the Gratitude Diaries. I think I disguised her, though she probably knows it was her. Um, and she had somebody who had a lovely life, but was always finding the problem with it. And I would always try to, I think the best thing you can do is to try to model something being positive. So when somebody tells you that, like, I can't believe I have to go into Manhattan 3 days a week now. It's so frustrating to, I used to be able to work remotely. You're like, yeah, but when you're in Manhattan, don't you get to do X, Y, or Z? And, isn't it, oh, you have all that time on the train and you could probably listen to a podcast. To try to help them see the positive way that they could look at something. But I know it's very difficult, and sometimes you just have to be straightforward about it and say, I hear what you're saying, and I know that's a problem, but let's just think about it from a positive viewpoint. Let's see how we can try to think about it from a good perspective. And sometimes it works. At least with my friend, she started to joke that I know you want me to look at it from a positive way, and eventually I think it might start to help a little bit. There are some people who will tell you that they are wired to see things negatively, to which I would say, then rewire. Because nobody is wired in such a way that you can't change how you think about things. There's research that the only things that we're actually wired for is anything in the brainstem, which is, basically below our just, our immediate reactions to things, not the way we think about things. So I think, and I think it's important with children also. If you have kids or grandkids, they'll tend to come home from school and tell you about all of the terrible things that happened on the second grade playground, right? And you want to listen to that because you're not meaning to dismiss it. But it also helps then, maybe before bed or sitting at the dinner table, to say, let's talk about something good that happened today. And and maybe that becomes part of the family meal, or once a week everybody says something good that happened. And everybody can say the worst thing and the best thing that happened in the day, but just so that there's that balance, and just so that we remember, yes, bad things happen, but let's look for the good things that happen too. Yes. I love that. That's absolutely lovely. That's just great. So once a week, they wrote the best thing that happened that week. That's all right. That's really lovely. Yeah, that's terrific. I'm going to steal that. I'm using that in all future talks. um, when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries, I realized I'm a writer, so I've always kept journals. And when do you write in your journal? You write in your journal when you're unhappy and when you're annoyed about something. And so all my journals were about the misery of life. And I thought, like, I'm going to die and my children will find this, and that's not how I feel. So I threw out a lot of journals, but also when my kids were little, I took a big notebook and I wrote the book of boys because I have two sons. And I would put in funny stories about them, and I would write good things that they had done and the things that I wanted to remember from the positive view. And that journal, my kids are obviously all grown, and that journal means a lot more to me than all of the misery and anguish that we also have, because those are the things you want to remember, and those are the things that you want to be remembered by. Yes. That's very lovely, and there's research into bird song also, and how comforting bird song is, and sometimes if you just go and sit in your backyard and close your eyes and enjoy the sunshine and just listen, it can also help you relax and feel better, and feel ready to face things, as your friend discovered with just enjoying the sunrise. That's beautiful. Anybody else? Well, thank you all so much. I hope you'll get a copy of the book. I'm very happy to sign them, and I really appreciate your being inside here with me on this beautiful day. And go outside afterwards, take the book, sit outside, and enjoy the sunshine. Thank you.